بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. Everyone probably really enjoyed today, mashallah. Right. So we started today with لَهُنَّ حِلٌّ لَهُمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحِلُّونَ لَهُنْ, that they, meaning the disbelieving men, are not halal for the believing women. وَلَا لَهُنْ, the believing women are not permissible for the disbelieving men. And then وَلَا هُمْ يَحِلُّونَ لَهُنْ, and neither the other way around. So now, one thing that we have been trying to do in these kind of summaries is that we try to connect it with what we've done in the past. As Shaykh Amin stressed today, that we should go back and we should listen to the Tafsīr, right, to kind of be able to connect things together. And every time you go back and you listen, you pick something up, right? So this, at the end of Surah Mujadila, we had the last ayah which talked about لا تجد قوما يؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر يوادون من حاد الله ولو كانوا آباءهم, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that you will not find a believing people that harbor or that hold love towards those that are at war or those that are at odds with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Man hadda Allah wa rasulah, and they have this animosity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, even if those people are their very own blood, right? Even if it's their own kin, right? And now when we come to Surah Mumtaḥana, and we get to this part where you have women from Mecca that have now become Muslim, and they are coming to Medina, we have the ruling that a Muslim woman cannot be in a nikah with a non-Muslim man, right? Now, emotionally, that's very difficult to accept. And I think that's one of the things that Sheikh Amin was touching on today, is that no one's saying that that's emotionally easy to accept, right? But the way I like to think about it is that there's each commitment or each relationship has a certain demand, right? And there are some relationships that you cannot have another relationship while you are in. So say if you're in relationship A, then the demand of that relationship is that you cannot also be in relationship B, right? Now, at a human level, right, we all understand that, right? With the exception of people whose morality is really skewed and crooked, right? People believe in loyalty and being faithful in a marriage, right? That if you're in a relationship that is through marriage, then you cannot be at the same time in an extramarital relationship, right? So that's something that as human beings, through our human code, right, that's something that's well accepted. Okay. Now, in that same way, when a person becomes Muslim, right, we have to understand that becoming Muslim is not just something like, oh, I'm kind of here like on a test run. I'm just trying it. Like it's something, logically it makes sense to me, right? It may start off like that, right? We're not gonna say that, we're not gonna accept shahada from people like unless they display like the highest level of taqwa, right? No, it's like it starts off, right? You even have in Sīrah and others that, then wahasuna Islamhum, then their Islam became perfected afterwards, right? It starts, right? There's a seedling, it starts, right? But as we talked about today, that the ideal of Iman, right? The ideal of Iman is that your love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will overpower the love that you have for anyone else, right? Till the extent that you cannot tolerate, right? That you will not tolerate, right? Someone who goes against or opposes the wishes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And unfortunately, what has happened today is that the general level or attachment or devotion to Iman has dropped so low, right, that we no longer see disbelief as an affront to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? We don't consider disbelief as a crime. Right? So it's like, okay, stealing is a crime, right? Uh, Adultery is a crime, fornication is a crime, right? Assault is a crime. But for some reason, not believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that doesn't come across to us as a crime, right? Because we only think of crimes as, oh, that's what's between human beings, right? Is because it's a very materialistic view, right? If you really think about it, because then you're thinking that, oh, it's just what I observe with my own eyes, right? I don't see God. So if someone doesn't believe in God, then so what? Right? So it's, you really have to question your own iman, that why am I not bothered by disbelief? Right? That why doesn't it agitate me? Right? Now, as throughout the surah, right, we've been talking about, it's one thing to be agitated by disbelief, right? That's one emotion. But at the same time, you have to regulate your emotions, as we talked about in the previous ayat, that if there's a disbeliever that is not harming you, that is not that is not preventing people from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you cannot show aggression against towards that disbeliever. Okay, so although that what's hated to you is not the person itself, it's the disbelief, right? Because, like we mentioned last time as well, that the moment the disbeliever will accept Islam, that person will become beloved to us. So if our hate was directed at the individual, then that person, even if they became Muslim, we will still hate them. Right? So this shows that our hate and our agitation, it's not towards the individual, it's towards the belief, it's towards the crime that's being committed against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So the reality of a person becoming a Muslim is that what they are saying spiritually is that now I have entered another relationship, and that is a relationship that has the dictates of love. Right? That when I love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I cannot tolerate there is someone that not only that simply doesn't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Or if there's a person that does shirk, they're taking the ni'mah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them, and they're attributing that ni'mah to someone else. Right? That's so you can put it in human terms as well. Right? That if you gave someone a favor, right, and it was just you that did it, you wouldn't like it if someone attributed that favor to someone else, right? Because they're not recognizing your favor, right? So when that's done to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's likewise a crime. Right? And if you are someone that loves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that should agitate you. Right? So that's one thing, right? لا هن حل لهم ولا هم يحلون لهم. And then last tafsir as well, we spoke about how the rulings of fiqh, right? And we last our recap session, we talked about how at the end of every ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's this theological component that's added, right? That theological component, it gives the grounding for the fiqh ruling, right? So every ruling in fiqh, right, it is grounded by a spiritual slash theological, theological tenet, right? So now you have this ruling in fiqh that the Muslim woman cannot be in a nikah with a disbelieving man, right? Well, what's the theological concept here? That's what Sheikh Amin had mentioned, right? What was that theological concept? That when you view your existence, right, you cannot view your existence as restricted to just this worldly life, right? You have an existence that stretches before this dunya, and it also has a existence that stretches after this dunya. Okay, so when you think about marriage, your marriage uh, should not be should not be viewed through the lens of just this dunya, right? As a Muslim, you must view your marriage as a way, as something that expands to Jannah as well, right? Just like if we look at the asal and we look at the origin of marriage, where did the first marriage occur? Which was in which was in Jannah, right? So marriage is a construct of Jannah. It originates in Jannah, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word zawj, right? Right? So it originates in Jannah, and what originates in Jannah, it is destined to return to Jannah, right? So that's how we view marriage, that my partner that's with me in this dunya is supposed to be with me in the akhirah as well, right? So now, if you're not going to be able to be with that spouse in Jannah, right? If the sister will not be able to be with the disbelieving, right, man in Jannah, then what's the purpose of that marriage, right? Then now this is where it's like, but she likes him, right? That's why we mentioned the first part, right? That the fact that you can like them as a human being, right? But there are certain crimes they say, look, okay, but I cannot live with that, right? So that emotion, your emotion, the person's attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to override other attachments that a person has, right? That's the reality of iman, right? So Sheikh Amin, he kind of identified the theological, right, perspective that marriage is supposed to be something that continues beyond this dunya and is something that goes into the akhirah as well. Okay? So that was regarding the theological and the spiritual components of why a Muslim woman cannot be in a nikah with a disbelieving man. Then we had some fiqh, right? Okay, so the fiqh, mashallah, we should give you guys a quiz and see how we do on the quiz. Okay, so if when a Muslim woman she leaves from a disbelieving man, right? What does the Muslim community have to do?
Repay the mahar.
We have to repay the mahar, right? You have to repay the dowry to the disbelieving man. Okay, right. Why? We don't want any favors from the disbelieving community upon us. Okay. Now, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid, right? If a Muslim woman she apostates and she goes to she goes to a disbelieving state. Okay, that's kind of what Sheikh Amin was mentioning over here, right? That a lot of these rules they have to do with statehood, right? So the idea that sometimes we want to remove state, right? And I say like, well, no, it's just something that's personal, right? But when you read many of the rules and you read the Quran, then it's like, no, this is something that you cannot just take the state out of it, right?
The word apostate.
Yeah, well, yeah. Even the word apostate has state in it, right? Okay. So now, when a Muslim woman, right, she right, she leaves Islam and she now goes to a disbelieving state, okay, what does the disbelieving state is the disbelieving state, right, supposed to do?
Supposed to also return.
They're supposed to return the dowry to the Muslim man, right? Now, is that going to happen, right? You're supposed to seek that reprisal, right? And the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, in some cases, they did, okay? Now, when that happens and the disbelieving state does not give that money back, what happens now?
Instead of starting a war, the Muslim state should make that individual whole.
Good. Now, in the Muslim state from there, all right, you can call it like the welfare system, right? Right? That's one of the functions of the Muslim state. The Muslim state is supposed to now repay the Muslim man, right? So again, you see that the state steps in. Okay, so these are some of the functions of the Muslim state. Okay, Now, this is something that, as an ideal that Muslims can take as communities, right, that perhaps are not in a Muslim state, right, that they may try to do this, they may try to, make up for that. The next thing that we then talked about is the bay'ah, right? Is about the pledge, okay? How the Prophet ﷺ would take pledges, right, from the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, and sometimes from women specifically, okay? And regarding different tenets, right? There would be different tenets. Okay? So Sheikh Amin, he mentioned that in Bayatul Aqaba, the Ansar, they came and they pledged that they would protect the Prophet ﷺ. At the time of jihad, the companions would take a bay'ah with the Prophet ﷺ that they would, they would be loyal, they wouldn't turn their back, so on and so forth. Then there were some very interesting there. Actually, there's some very private bay'ah that the Prophet ﷺ would take as well with a certain group of Sahaba, right? There are some group of Sahaba that took a very specific bay'ah with the Prophet ﷺ that they would not ask anyone other than Allah anything, right? That was actually one of the tenets of their bay'ah. Okay, so the Sahaba radiallahu anhum that took this bay'ah, right? Um, it comes. You can read this in a hadith actually that if one of them dropped the dropped what they were holding in their hand while they were on top of a camel, even if there was someone right there, they would not ask the person, "Can you hand me my stick?" Right? They would actually make the camel kneel down, get off dismount from their camel, pick up their stick, and go back. Right? Now that's a different level of tawheed. Right? Now, that's a level of tawheed that, like, even in, right, that wouldn't be like asking like other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But that's how they understood their bay'ah. That's how seriously they took it, right? So they implemented it, they internalized it at a very high level, right? That I'm someone that I only ask from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if it is something that Allah has made the sabab in this world, that someone else could be the sabab of that, right? Could be the means of that. But it was their ghayrah and their attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They said, I'm not going to ask anyone else, right? So, right, just talking about this idea of like attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So how attached they were to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. So in this particular bay'ah, as many of the mufassirun, they actually mention that the ayah about test them when they come, right? Test the women when they come. The bay'ah, according to many of the mufassirun, was the test, right? That make them take bay'ah. If they take bay'ah, they have now proved their iman with these conditions, right? Of then Sheikh Amin, he pointed out that there are most of the tenets of the bay'ah that were over here, right? To not do shirk, to not steal, to not commit adultery or fornication, right? To not kill their children, right? Obviously, there's the very extreme form of that. You actually kill the child this once is born, so on and so forth. And then there are other more subtle forms of that, right? Is like once the ruh is in the child, right, aborting, so on and so forth. Right, and then not to slander other people by claiming that this child belongs to so and such man, even though it doesn't belong to such and such man. Right? Okay, so that's وَلَا يَأْتِينَ بِبُهْتَانٍ يَفْتَرِينَهُ بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِنْ وَأَرْجُلِهِنْ. And then very general, to not disobey the Prophet ﷺ in any good that he commands. Okay? Now, one of the things over here that Sheikh Amin, he focused on was that, that we're treating that Muslims historically, they did not allow, and still till today, right, no mushrik is allowed in the peninsula, right, in the Jaziratul Arab, right? Now, the question over here is not that we need to provide or not that we need to justify it, right? But just sometimes for us to kind of understand, like, okay, what might be the hikmah, right? I think the hikmah is very clear, right? Is that every, right, every nation, right, or you can say the nation in the sense of you have a ummah that's a millah, or that's a religious community, right? Every religious community has to have what they call their own, right? And Yes, right? Whereas outside of that land, right, you will conduct business, you will have interactions with those of other faiths, right? We don't imagine that there's going to be a land where there's going to be only Muslims, right? That's utopian to a whole different level, right? But the idea that, when you want to, right, say that this is now for our ibadah, right? This is a place of where we come to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? You cannot have the effect of disbelief in that area, right? That's not something that we will compromise on, okay? Now they are given an option: either you can stay or you can leave, right? So now when they refuse that option, they say, no, we're not going to leave. Now you're challenging the authority of the land, right? So that's rebellion now, right? And rebellion is met with, military strength, right? So you can frame it, right, in that you can frame it in that political context, right? That if other religious communities, right, even today, right, and I think that's what Sheikh Amin was trying to get at, right? I don't think that we should misunderstand what he was trying to say, that, oh well, if if another religious community is doing something that is incorrect, we can justify it by, okay, they're doing something incorrect, we can do something incorrect too. No, what's being justified, right, is that or if a religious community, right, by the human contract that we have, the social human contract that we share as inhabitants of, this dunya, that religious communities are allowed to have a holy land, right? That if we respect every religious community's claim to a holy land, right, then we also have this claim to our holy land, right? Now the question that's obviously going to come, and that's going to be a much longer discussion, is that, you know when is the claim historically accepted, right? How far back are you going, right? I mean, that opens a whole different discussion, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have that discussion. I'm just saying that in the remaining time, we don't have the time for that discussion, right? Um, I think it's just very simply we can put it that, there's really has only been one revealed religion, and that has been Islam, right? So that Islam is the religion of all Anbiya: Ibrahim alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, right? So all three holy sites, that would be Masjid al-Nabawi, Masjid al-Haram, and Masjid al-Aqsa, they are our holy lands. We have a claim to them, right? So that's, whether that sounds like, yes, we are dominant, that's because we are the Khulafa of Allah on earth, and we are meant to be dominant, right? If that's something that Muslims want to shy away with, then that's a problem that Muslims have. That's not a problem with Islam, right? Okay, so that's just a little bit about that. Okay, and then the last part was "Taghfir lahunna Allah, inna Allah ghafur rahim," right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructs the Prophet ﷺ to seek forgiveness for them, right? Seek forgiveness for the women, meaning, have they done something wrong? No, it's foreseeing that there are going to be slips, right? So we always set the ideal, right? But then we also always factor in that there is going to be a human component, okay? And he beautifully connected that to how in our own lives, right, we need to implement that, okay? That we need to be inclusive of people when they make mistakes. But I think the balance over here, right, the balance over here is that you don't make policies based on inclusiveness, right? You don't make The governing body does not pass laws based on inclusiveness. The law is passed according to the ideal, right? When there is a, when something, when there's a slip, right? That's where forgiveness comes in, right? So now, if you look at the hudud, if you look at the state mandated punishments, right? Though they're designed the way they are on purpose, they're designed to allow for individual mistakes, right? They're designed to allow for individual mistakes, right? Private, right? When that mistake becomes so blatantly public, now you're actually either harming society, and that's what we cannot tolerate, or the person is publicly challenging the moral fabric of the society, right? They're wanting to damage and change the fabric of the society, right? So that's the purpose of the hudud. They're as deterrents, right? Privately, we have always understood people are going to make mistakes, right? So we forgive those, right? As a state policy, we forgive those because as long as they're private, no one's coming knocking on your door and saying, "Hey, did this happen?" Right? It's only when it is raised to the ruler, right? That's when it becomes implemented, so on and so forth. Okay, so these were some of the, and I think just last point that like we can implement this in our life. And I think Sheikh Amin, he speaks about this a lot, is that we often try to like we kind of like isolate ourselves, right? And we isolate ourselves in the sense that like, oh, they have problems, I can't work with them, right? And like I don't like what they do, so I don't agree with their policies, and I don't, they don't practice, they're not practicing, so on and so forth, right? But that's not wastaghfir lahunallah, right? So and I think like even like as myself as an individual, right, it's just like sometimes you have this kind of you feel awkward, or you kind of you don't it's like, oh, like that's not how I do things, right? But if everyone just sticks to their corner, it's like, well, then you're not really going to do much work for deen, right? So sometimes you have to get over that and be like, okay, I accept that there are mistakes, right? They're making mistakes, but I'm still going to work with them because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told me that, astaghfir lahunallah, Allah ghafur rahim. Yeah. So we have like 3-4 minutes, right? So anyone has any reflections, questions, right? We can take that, inshallah. Ibrahim, you were sharing some reflections before, mashallah. You can share with everyone, inshallah.
Sure, yeah. So actually, one question that I had was around, you know, this concept of sort of statehood, and how far does it extend into these certain circumstances? Right, today, you could argue that there sort of isn't any Muslim state anywhere in the world, but definitively here, living in the West, quote unquote, we don't have that for sure. And so when it comes to some of these challenging scenarios where, one, do you even define, like, how do you define apostate, or one way or the other, right? Whether somebody is converting to Islam and leaving the marriage and coming into the Muslim community, or leaving, right? God forbid. But where do we need to draw the line in terms of like, should we be providing, recompensating somebody for life, right? For example, and then where does that sort of fall into? And I know these are sort of fard kifaya, like larger types of things, but like, how does it fall into the other list of prioritized things, right? And how much of that is we should strive to do it versus, well, it's actually an obligation on us that we need to fulfill.
Yeah. So I think the statehood would kind of fall into like defining whether is this an obligation, right? Or is this like an ideal that we want to try to like meet, right? So because like, for example, like giving the mahar back and stuff like that, right? We don't have the state over here.
There's no Bayt
right?
al-Mal.
So there's no Bayt al-Mal, right? So that doesn't, right? Now, as an ideal, if Muslims want to try to do that, right? That's good, right? So for example, if there's like a Muslim man, so on and so forth, right? When billah, it happens that their like wife leaves or whatever, right? That is an ideal that we could try to uphold, right? But since we wouldn't say that, okay, well, Muslims are going to be sinful if they don't, right? Yeah. So that's one way that we put that together. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. So subhanallah bihamdihi subhanakallah bihamdik nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.